The bulldozer operator looked concerned. He said with hesitation, Sir, there's a man in a lawn chair yelling and eating ribs. That man was me. Behind me were the ruins of my backyard. My garden was decimated, my koi pond obliterated, and my fire pit turned into a gravel crater. The ceramic Japanese lantern my late father had given me was now rubble mixed with the remnants of my prize-winning tomato plants. In front of me stood a half-dozen HOA board members, all wearing matching visors and holding clipboards like they were hosting the suburban Hunger Games. They formed a semicircle around Marla Yates like she was their queen bee, each one nodding in synchronized agreement with whatever nonsense she spewed. The worst one, Marla Yates, sipped her iced tea and said with a dismissive tone, Well, you should be in the HOA. That was the moment I decided if they wanted war, I'd give them a barbecue-flavored apocalypse. My name's Wes Ranklin. I'm a freelance machinist, semi-retired, with a fondness for peace, brisket, and watching squirrels get drunk off my fermented crab apples. I spent 30 years working in aerospace, making precision parts for satellites, which taught me two things. First, documentation matters. Second, always keep receipts. I live in Cypress Hollow Estates, or more accurately, adjacent to it. My house, a 1962 ranch-style beauty with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that still has avocado green appliances I refuse to replace, predates the subdivision by 3 decades. It was grandfathered in, not under HOA jurisdiction. Not legally. Not morally. Not spiritually. My property deed, which I keep in a fireproof safe along with my smoker recipes, clearly states I'm exempt from any future homeowners associations. Marla Yates, however, disagreed. She ran the Cypress Hollow HOA like a suburban warlord. She had a blonde bob that never moved even in hurricane-force winds, always wore a tennis visor despite never playing tennis, and drove a Range Rover with HOA-1 on the plates. If you left a rake in your front yard for more than 11 minutes, she sent a citation and a fruitcake. The fruitcake was always stale, possibly weaponized. It was passive aggression at its finest. But for years she left me alone. We had an unspoken truce. I kept my front yard reasonably tidy, and she pretended my backyard didn't exist. That changed with what I now call the Great Land Grab of July. It started with a flag. I put up a vintage Don't Tread on Me flag in the backyard right by my smoker, a custom-built offset smoker I'd welded myself that could hold 3 briskets and still have room for ribs. 2 days later I got a letter in my mailbox. It was unsigned, of course, printed on HOA letterhead that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery bill, claiming I was violating aesthetic harmony and creating visual pollution. Then came the citations. They started at $25 each, then $50, then $100. They cited my pond as an unauthorized water feature requiring permits I'd never heard of. They called my fire pit an illegal structure that violated setback requirements that didn't exist. They classified my vegetable garden as commercial agriculture in a residential zone. They even listed my dog Marvin, a 13-year-old beagle who spent most of his time sleeping, as unregistered livestock due to excessive barking, which was hilarious because Marvin only barked at the ice cream truck. I laughed, ignored them, and continued living my HOA-free life. The fines kept coming. By week 3, they claimed I owed $4,700 in accumulated violations. That's when Ted from 2 houses down stopped by. Ted was on the HOA board but hated every minute of it. He warned me that Marla was planning something big at the next meeting. He said with genuine concern, Wes, she's got blueprints and everything. She's calling it Project Reclamation. I should have listened to Ted. That's when Marla got creative. She claimed my backyard was technically within Cypress Hollow boundaries. She cited a map she'd printed from Google Earth, which she'd apparently edited in Microsoft Paint to include my property. The lines were literally drawn with the spray paint tool. She said the HOA had reclaimed it for community development under eminent domain, which isn't even something HOAs can do. I asked what that meant. She said with a condescending smile while adjusting her visor, We're thinking bocce court, maybe a meditation garden for the ladies' wine club. I told her to get off my land. She called a surveyor. One she hired herself, a guy named Randy who operated out of his van and whose business card was printed at Kinko's. Guess what the survey said? Technically theirs. Randy's survey included my backyard, half my driveway, and somehow a portion of my living room. The next week I woke up to bulldozers in my begonias. I called the sheriff. Deputy Martinez showed up, took one look at the destruction, and said with disbelief, "They did this while you were sleeping?" The sheriff called the county. The county pulled the actual plat maps from 1996, which had to be retrieved from the basement archives because Marla had mysteriously requested all digital copies be updated for accuracy just 2 months prior. Turned out not only was my land not part of the HOA, but Marla's Google Earth map included 40 feet of a public park, part of a Domino's pizza location, and inexplicably, a slice of the interstate that ran behind the neighborhood. The county clerk, an older woman named Dorothy who'd been there since the Carter administration, actually laughed when she saw Marla's map. But the damage was done. My koi were gone, including Herbert, a 20-year-old butterfly koi who'd survived 2 divorces and a tornado. My smoker was buried under rubble. Marvin hadn't stopped barking since Tuesday. The poor dog was traumatized by the destruction of his favorite napping spots and refused to go in the backyard. Then I found the smoking gun. It was an email thread forwarded to me by Janet Kowalski, Marla's own treasurer who'd finally had enough after Marla tried to embezzle funds for a personal hot tub. God bless internal HOA drama. The subject line read Operation Backyard Liberation, like they were planning D-Day instead of stealing my turnips. In the emails Marla explicitly planned to, and I quote, "take that weird loner's yard and fold it into the master plan." She called me a blight on the community who probably makes moonshine, which was offensive because I make excellent craft beer, not moonshine. That email also mentioned selling it to a landscape designer friend named Cheryl for aesthetic enhancement and a kickback cruise to Aruba. There were spreadsheets attached showing projected profits from seizing not just my land, but 3 other properties that bordered the HOA. Marla had gone full manifest destiny on my tomatoes. The emails showed 6 months of planning. She'd been photographing my yard with a telephoto lens, documenting every weed, every unpainted fence board, every time Marvin did his business. She'd been waiting for the right moment to strike, and my flag gave her the excuse she needed. Armed with the real plat maps, the email chain which I'd printed in triplicate and had notarized, and a furious Marvin in a little bow tie because it was court day, I filed suit. My lawyer, Jimmy Chen, a former prosecutor who'd quit to fight HOA tyranny full-time, took one look at the evidence and said with barely contained glee, "Christmas came early this year." I sued for property destruction, trespassing, fraud, conspiracy to illegally rezone, and intentional infliction of emotional distress on both me and Marvin. I threw the book at her like it owed me money. The court granted a temporary restraining order against the HOA entering my property. The judge actually used the words unconscionable and borders on organized crime in his ruling. The county zoning board launched a formal investigation into Marla's activities. She tried to deflect, saying she was acting in the community's best interest and that property values would increase 30% with her improvements. The judge, Harold Fitzgerald, a man who hadn't blinked since 1983 and who'd once held a developer in contempt for sneezing too loudly, replied with barely contained annoyance. "Miss Yates, you bulldozed a man's koi pond for bocce. You destroyed a vegetable garden that fed his family. You traumatized a senior dog. You are not the Lorax." The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter. Even the court reporter cracked a smile. Marla's face turned the color of an overripe tomato. She tried to argue that property values would increase with proper landscaping and that my aesthetic choices were bringing down the entire neighborhood. The judge wasn't having it. He pointed out that destroying someone's property without permission is called vandalism, regardless of your intentions or opinions about their garden gnomes. The investigation revealed more than just my case. Detective Rodriguez from the White Collar Crime Unit discovered Marla had been systematically trying to expand HOA boundaries for years like some sort of suburban conquistador. She'd intimidated 3 other homeowners into joining, all through fraudulent maps and fake surveys. The Johnsons, a retired couple who just wanted to grow roses in peace, thought they'd been in the HOA for 2 years, paying $150 monthly in dues, only to discover their house was never part of it. The Patels had been fined $8,000 over 3 years for violations on property the HOA didn't even control, including citations for their meditation garden which Marla called an unpermitted religious structure. There was also the Hendersons, who'd been forced to remove a wheelchair ramp because it wasn't pre-approved by the architectural committee that had no jurisdiction over their property. Detective Rodriguez spent 3 weeks unraveling what he called the most elaborate HOA fraud he'd ever seen. He found Marla had created false documents using her job's resources at Pinnacle Property Management. She'd used the company printer for fake surveys, running up $12,000 in color printing costs. She'd applied the company seal on fraudulent documents, telling her boss it was for legitimate HOA business. She'd even billed the HOA for legal consultations that never happened, pocketing $35,000 over 2 years. Her cousin, the paralegal, turned out to be a dental hygienist named Brad who'd watched a lot of Law and Order and once served on a jury for a jaywalking case. Brad cracked immediately when questioned, admitting Marla paid him $500 to wear a suit and nod seriously during HOA meetings. The district attorney, Patricia Wong, got involved personally. Criminal charges were filed. Fraud, conspiracy, destruction of property, racketeering, and embezzlement. Yes, racketeering. Turns out when you run an HOA like the mafia, you get mafia charges. They also added identity theft because she'd forged 3 homeowner signatures on HOA membership documents, mail fraud for sending fake legal notices through USPS, and elder abuse for what she'd done to the Johnsons. The civil trial was swift and brutal. My lawyer presented a slideshow that included before and after photos of my backyard. The before photos showed my garden in full bloom, the koi pond with its little waterfall I'd built myself, and Marvin sunbathing by the fire pit. The after photos looked like a war zone. One juror audibly gasped. Another shook her head in disgust. The court ruled decisively in my favor. Marla was ordered to pay $175,000 in damages. That included $50,000 for the koi pond and the traumatic loss of Herbert and his fishy friends, $30,000 for the landscaping including my heritage tomato plants whose seeds came from my grandfather's garden in Italy, $25,000 for emotional distress to both me and Marvin with the judge specifically noting Marvin's psychiatric needs, and $70,000 in punitive damages because, as the judge put it, this level of suburban terrorism cannot go unpunished. The HOA was ordered to rebuild everything exactly as it was, down to the garden gnome I'd nicknamed Colonel Mustard and the hand-painted sign that said Wes's Zen Zone. They had to use the same contractor I originally used, Big Mike's Landscaping, at triple the normal rate because of the rush job and the fact that Big Mike really didn't like Marla after she'd cited his work truck for being an eyesore. But the criminal trial was where things got really interesting. The prosecutor presented evidence of a pattern of fraud spanning 5 years. Marla had embezzled over $200,000 in HOA funds, taken kickbacks from contractors totaling $60,000, and falsified enough documents to fill 3 bankers' boxes. She'd created fake vendors, submitted false invoices, and even charged the HOA for a leadership conference in Hawaii she'd never attended. The jury deliberated for exactly 47 minutes. 30 of those minutes were just lunch break. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison with no possibility of early release and ordered her to pay $400,000 in restitution to various victims. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear Marla's perfectly manicured nails tapping on the defendant's table. Marla was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. Her real estate license was revoked after the state board reviewed her case. She lost her job at the property management company where she worked, and they sued her separately for the misuse of company resources. The Cypress Hollow HOA had to implement new bylaws requiring 3 independent surveys before any property disputes, mental health evaluations for board members, and a community vote for any action involving property lines. They also had to publicly acknowledge my property boundaries at every meeting for the next 10 years. When the verdict was read, Marla's perfectly composed facade finally cracked like cheap foundation in the desert sun. She stood up and shouted that this was a conspiracy, that I had orchestrated everything to destroy her reputation and prevent the neighborhood from reaching its full potential. She claimed the koi pond was a health hazard, the flag was anti-American somehow, and that Marvin was actually a wolf hybrid. The bailiff had to escort her out as she screamed about property values and the importance of uniform mailbox heights. Her lawyer just shook his head and started packing his briefcase, probably calculating how much she still owed him. As they led her away in handcuffs, her visor finally fell off, revealing badly done root touch-ups. She turned to me one last time and said with venom dripping from every word, "Your grass is still too long." I smiled and waved goodbye with a half-eaten rib in my hand.